But we're going to do Don't You Trust Me, Part 3, and then we're going to move on to a different topic. Still in Abraham, but a different topic. Don't you trust me? So this young lady brought her fiance home to meet her parents, and the father decided to take the young man into his study, said, I need to get to know this young man. So he takes him into his study, starts asking him these questions. He says, so what are your plans for the future? And he says, well, I'm a biblical scholar. And he goes, really, a biblical scholar? Well, that's a very admirable profession, but I also happen to know that doesn't tend to make a ton of money. So what are you going to do to provide a house for my daughter? And he goes, well, I will do my studies and God will provide. He goes, okay, well, how are you going to provide a beautiful engagement ring for my daughter, such as she deserves? And he says, I'll continue my studies and God will provide. He says, how will you provide for the children? And he just keeps going, God will provide. And every question that's asked, he just keeps answering, God will provide, God will provide. And so the father and the mother catch up later. They reconnect later in the evening. And the mother asks the father, he says, well, how did things go? And what'd you find out? And he goes, well, he has no plans, he has no job, and he thinks, I'm God. God is so good to his children. So far we've watched how Abraham trusted God, and God took care of him. And we saw how we can trust God's perfect promises. And we're going to look and see how God came through on one of his promises in a huge way today. We learned how we can trust God's perfect timing. And then you remember the last point, that we can trust God's perfect plan, even when it doesn't make sense. And I'm just going to tell you, sometimes God's thinking is way different than our thinking, and his plan doesn't seem to make sense, but we believe we can trust him anyway. Amen? Okay? So, today we're going to look at another way we can trust God. Genesis chapter 21, starting in verse 1. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. We learned we can trust God's perfect promises. See that there. Verse 2, Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. We can trust God's perfect timing. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. All right, so God finally comes through on the big promise. Abraham's been waiting 25 years. God finally comes through. Isaac is born. It's celebration time, right? Yay, celebrate. Isaac has been born. Happy birthday to Isaac. I'll bet Abraham is just so happy right now. Finally, a son that came from his own body through Sarah. I'll bet there were many times where Abraham doubted, but God finally came through. All right, now let's go over to chapter 22. In chapter 22, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Man, are you like really confused if you're Abraham right now? Like, wait a minute. We've been waiting 25 years for this promised child. 25 years, it finally comes true. He's born. It's estimated that Isaac is about 12 years old, somewhere around there. And he's going to be, all these descendants are going to come, as many as the stars are in the sky. That's how many descendants are going to come through this son, Isaac. But now God's asking me to sacrifice him on an altar. This doesn't make sense. I mean, talk about trusting God's plan when it doesn't make sense, right? This had to challenge his faith in a major way. And this is the big question, is how can God make him into a great nation if he's dead? That's the confusing point, right? How can he make all these descendants if Isaac is dead? And there's only one way that could be true, and it's only if you believe in miracles. And that is that Abraham would sacrifice Isaac on the altar kill him, and then God would raise him back from the dead. That's the only way that Abraham could sacrifice his son and his son still turn into this great nation with many descendants. In fact, that's what the book of Hebrews says. Hebrews 11:17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham, here's the key point, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Man, talk about some gigantic faith that Abraham must have had. To believe that I'm going to sacrifice my son and God's going to raise him back from the dead and bring him back to life. And that's how he's going to have all these descendants, right? So let's watch what happens when Abraham trusts in God. And as we read the rest of the story, I want you to watch for the answer when Isaac asks the question, where is the lamb for the sacrifice? Watch for the answer to that question. Where is the lamb for the sacrifice? Verse 3. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, what did he call it? "The Lord will provide." And to this day it has been said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." So what was the answer when Isaac asked Abraham, "Where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" What was the answer?
God will provide.
Yeah, God will provide. Say it again with me. God will provide. One more time. God will provide. Do we believe that this morning, church?
Yes.
God will provide. So we need to trust God's perfect promises and his perfect provision. Provision that he's going to provide for our needs. Abraham is this great example of trusting in God. From the day he left Ur of the Chaldees and ventured off to the land God would show him, he was trusting in God. And not that he was perfect. He had his moments where he doubted, but overall he trusted God, and God took care of him. Somebody gave me a card that had a saying on it one time. It says, "Where God guides, he provides." In other words, if God is leading you to do something, he's going to give you what you need for that thing. Do you believe that this morning? If God calls you to do something, he's going to give you what you need to get the job done. And I knew that my dad had a really cool couple of stories where God provided for them in a really special way. So I'd like to ask him if he'd come up and share that story with us.
Well, it seems like we're talking about young men dying, all the whole thing here. The young men, Eutychus and Isaac. And Chandler's back from the dead. Yay! And so I was 16. I was supposed to drive home and be home. It was Easter Sunday at a certain time. And if I didn't arrive home by a certain time, I lost privileges for the car, and I had to pay for the insurance, which my parents would pay for as long as I was on time. Well, my girlfriend and I kissed a little bit longer than we should have, and I left, and I had 15 minutes to make a half-hour drive. So I just had to pedal to the metal. Not wise, anybody, no matter how old you are. I had to pedal to the metal, and I had my knee up. I was driving with my knee up, and the guy came really close to me, and my knee hit the lights, and I couldn't see. So I reached down, I kept it right in the middle of the road, reached down, and I thought I was in the middle of the road. When the lights came on, I was this way, and I went up a mountain and flipped it over and broke 2 of the posts. One more post, I would have been dead. My leg broke right here, just came right out of the skin, and I crawled out of the car, and I thought, I'm going to die right now. I'm going to die right now. And don't you know, I wasn't a Christian yet, but I prayed. Praying foxholes, don't you? I wasn't a Christian. And the second car behind me was a Pennsylvania State Trooper. We called the ambulance, we called the hospital, the ER to get ready, to bring in the specialist to put my leg back together. And I don't think that was an accident, do you?
It's definitely a blessing.
Amen. So I know I've talked before to some of you about a guy named George Mueller, and he's an amazing example of trust and faith. So this guy felt called to reach orphans. He ended up starting 5 different houses that housed orphans, housed over 1,000 different orphans. And this guy never once asked for a penny from anybody. Never did any fundraising. He simply prayed and asked God to provide, and God did. And there's a famous, well-documented occasion where the children had no food on the table, nothing to eat. And he said, well, what do we do in these moments, children? We pray. And so they prayed. And next thing you know, this bread guy says he was up all night. This baker says, I was up all night. I just felt like I needed to bring you some bread. And he delivered bread to the breakfast table. And then the milk truck breaks down right in front of the orphanage and says, look, I need to get some of this milk off my cart. I'm broken down. That happened. And he has many well-documented. He kept very detailed journals of when God answered these prayers. What an amazing example of faith. You know, like few of us know what it means to trust God on that level. To just pray, you know, and just believe that God's going to deliver. So a lot of times, though, what we do, Abraham, you know, he was a great example of trusting, but he also had his moments where he kind of took matters into his own hands and tried to manhandle the situation. Does everybody know when I say manhandle the situation? Like, I'm going to force this thing to work. You know, I've seen guys where guys are working on something with tools or whatever, and something's not fitting right, and they just jam it in there, right? Like, I'm going to make this thing fit. Now, be honest, how many of you had a Rubik's Cube when you were younger and did this? You tried to work it, and you couldn't figure it out, and so you peeled all the stickers off and put the stickers back and said, look, I did it, be honest. You manhandled the Rubik's Cube, right? You're like, I'm going to make this thing be what it's supposed to be. So Abraham had 2 different moments where he manhandled the situation. So the first one was, I talked about earlier, where God called him to leave his hometown and go to the land where God would show him. So that's in Genesis 12. Genesis 13, he gets to the land and God says, look, as far as you can see, east, west, around, I'm giving you this land. He's there, right? He's at this land that he was promised. Next thing you know, there's a famine, and he's taken off to Egypt. Why? He's manhandling the situation. He knows, instead of staying there and trusting God that God can provide even in the midst of a famine, he says, I better take matters into my own hands and go to Egypt. God didn't tell him to go to Egypt, right? That wasn't the instructions, go to Egypt. It was go to the land where I will show you. I think that was Abraham doing what many of us tend to do. I'm going to take matters into my own hands. Another incident in the life of Abraham is, you know, they're waiting on this promised son that God was going to give them, and 15 years into it, there's still no son. And so what do? Abraham and Sarah take matters into their own hands, And Sarah says, why don't you sleep with my handmaiden Hagar, and we'll make this child thing happen, right? They took matters into their own hands rather than just continuing to stay the course and wait on God's timing and trust God to do it in His time and in His way. And a lot of times we do that, especially when we struggle financially, right? We've all been there, haven't we? When we struggle financially and we freak out and we say, okay, I got to do something, right? I got to do something. I can't just sit here and struggle. So we take on a second job, we take on a third job, we do whatever. And I've heard this told to me by multiple people where when they did that, they took on a second job, they started making this extra money, and yet at the end of the year, after 1 year's time, they had nothing extra to show for it. I've talked to multiple people that happened to. They tried to manhandle it, and it just didn't work. And I just wonder if God's up in heaven saying, won't you trust me? Won't you trust me? I know it's hard. It's very difficult to trust God in a moment like that, right? When you have a need, and you're like, where's this coming from? I don't see where this is coming from. I don't see how God is going to provide. But God wants us to wait on Him, and He has rewarded those who do that. George Mueller is one of those. And so when we struggle financially, try not to manhandle things. We do this with other situations. We try to manhandle and make something happen. So after I had gone to Harding for about 1.5 years, my dad called me up one time and said, so Jeremy, have you started to date anybody yet? Have you met anybody? And I said, no, Dad, I haven't even come close to meeting anybody. Like, not even close. And he says, well, let me ask you this. Would you mind if I paid for eHarmony, would you do eHarmony if I paid for it? How many of you know what eHarmony, what I'm talking about? The matchmaking site, right? So I was like, well, I guess if you're paying for it, sure, I'll go for it. Why not? So I take this online test. It takes like 2 days to do this test. It's forever long. And they're going to match you up on 50 million points and match you up with this other person that they think is a good match for you. I only got one lead on a date in 6 months, and it didn't work out at all. So then this friend of mine mentioned this thing called Christian Cafe. And Christian Cafe was free. They're like, well, you can just go on this. It has singles, Christian singles. Go on there. Give that a try. I'm like, oh, that's free. Why not? Sure. So I do that. Get one date from that. It was a total disaster. Just awful. Awful. Finally, I get to that point where I'd given up. I did. I prayed my prayer. I said, God, if you want me to be single for the rest of my life, I guess I'll be okay with that. I don't really like it, but I'll be okay with that if that's your will, right? And then I met Andrea. And I met her in a college class. We had a college class together. And from the first day I met her, I just knew that she liked me. So what happened is, she came in and she sat in the chair right next to me. And so I just knew that was a sign that she liked me right away. Forget that it was the only chair open in the whole room. It was right next to me. I'm like, ooh, hey, who's this sitting right next to me? So at the end of the class, the professor says, now, next class period, when you come in next week, wherever you're going to sit is going to be your seat for the rest of the semester. So, if you care where you sit, get here early and get in the seat that you want. So at this point, Andrea turns to me and says, hey, would you save me a seat? When you get here early next week, will you save me a seat? I'm like, hey, yes, I will. I sure will save you a seat. Now, she has a different version of her interpretation of how this story went. She says the story according to her was that she had the class before this one was all the way across campus, and it took her 10 minutes to walk across campus to get there, and she knew she wouldn't be able to get there early, and she didn't want a bad seat. And I looked like a responsible person who would get there early, and she didn't want to sit in the back somewhere. And so she said, are you going to get here early and get a seat up front? Yes, will you save me a seat? That was her version, but I knew it was because she liked me. And this is where it was going. Anyway, this is what we tend to do as humans. We want to trust God. We plan to trust God to provide, but then when it doesn't happen in the time we want it to, we take matters into our own hands, right? And we get on as many online dating services and Christian singles things and these things, and in the end, none of those things worked. In the end, it was simply trusting in God and in His timing, and He put us together. It was in his way. Instead of manhandling, we need to pray. And it's hard. It's hard to retrain our brains instead of, we want to jump in there and make something happen, right? And do it. It's hard to resist that, but to trust in God in George Mueller fashion. He didn't freak out. He just said, okay, we have no food. Okay, what do we do, children? We pray. And they prayed, and God delivered. God delivered. And so we need to trust that God will provide wherever he calls us. And so to some of us, he might be saying, I want you to buy a home and create a Christian children's home for foster kids. This is a true story. This actually happened to a couple I met in Heber Springs, Arkansas. I was talking to this guy, and he said he felt like God put it on their heart to start a children's home. And he was talking about, I don't know where I'm going to get the money, and we tend to have these conversations with God. We say, but God, where's the money going to come from? This is going to cost money to buy this house. And what about all the government red tape? And how am I going to get through all these hoops? And God's just saying, look, I've called you to it. I'm going to help you get there. I'm going to give you the money. I'll take care of the government red tape. Your job is to step out in faith and trust that I'll provide. That's your job. And maybe to some of you, he's saying, I want you to go to a discovery lab in Desdemona, Texas. And I want you to see if you're qualified to be a church planner. And then we get the price tag, and it's $1,800. And we go, but God, where are we going to get $1,800 to be able to go to this thing? And God's like, you silly humans, you silly sons and daughters of mine. Don't you know if I call you to go do that thing, I'm going to take care of you? And I'm just confession time, I'm being honest this morning. I really thought we were going to get up to February and still need more money for this thing. And we were going to have to send out more appeal letters and call more people and say, hey, we're still lacking $500. Can you help, and all this. And God was like, you silly people. I got this taken care of. In fact, I'm going to take care of the $1,800 by Christmas. And he did. And in fact, we even got more than what we needed. Praise God. And by the way, don't you just hearing that feel like, okay, God's in this church plant. Like he's gonna make this thing work. It's gonna work. He's already shown, time and time again so far, I got this thing. I got the money thing. We got approved. Woohoo! We got approved. These people run us through the ringer and said we're not crazy. We can do church planning. Well, we're a little crazy. Because anyone who wants to do church planning is a little bit crazy. But God's got this thing. And so maybe you're trying to find a spouse. Maybe you're trying to find a job. Maybe you're trying to find a house. Don't give up too soon and try to take matters into your own hands. Wait and trust God all the way through this thing. Wait on him and trust him all the way through. And the thing about it is, if you wait on the Lord, he has perfect provision. And many times when we take matters into our own hands, we may get the result we want, but I'm going to tell you this, it's not as good as what God would have given you if you had waited on him. How many of you know that's true? If we wait on him, he has a way of giving us even more and abundantly what we can imagine. And so may we believe that God is capable of providing for your needs. May we show our trust in real and tangible ways. May we resist the urge to take matters into our own hands and try to force something to happen. May we bask in the goodness of seeing God come through and see him take care of us. And then may we tell others about God's goodness and give our testimony of what he's done for us. Amen. So we've got some next steps in the back of your Connect card that I'm going to lay out there for some options for you to steps you can take this week. The first one is resist the urge to manhandle the situation. And so your plan is, I want to catch myself this week when I see that urge to take things into my own hands and manhandle it and make something happen. I'm going to resist that urge this week. Some of you may want to check that box and do that this week. Some of you may want to get a group of people to pray together with you. So I learned a really cool principle in the art of making websites and getting your website to rank up high. There's this thing called a link circle. And it's where you get 5 of your buddies who also know how to do a website, where you link to each other's website. So I find a friend who has a website, and I put a link to his website in my website. And we link to each other's websites, and it completes a link circle. And my guy who trained me said, when you do that link circle, it gives more power to Google. Google sees that, and it gives more power and more credibility and makes you rank higher in your site. And I thought, that's a pretty cool illustration of prayer. Like, when we get in trouble, we need to form a link circle between our friends. And we need to circle up and get other people praying. And so often our pride gets in the way, and we don't want to admit that we're struggling with something or that we need something. But God gives more power, I believe, to group prayer. He says that many times in His Word. That God, it's not that He doesn't hear your individual prayer, but it's like He gives a little more power, a little more oomph to when people humble themselves in a group setting. And He says, where 2 of you agree on earth, it will be done in heaven. There's something powerful about group prayer, the Bible says. And so some of you want to do that. Some of you may want to do daily devotions 5 days this week so that you can hear God's direction. Here's the thing, guys. God is our shepherd, and He wants to guide us, and He wants to show us where to go. But we can't hear His leading if we don't spend time with the Good Shepherd and learn to hear His voice. If we're not spending that daily time with the Good Shepherd, I'm just telling you, there's been so many times in mine and Andrea's life where, because we were doing those daily devotions, some scripture spoke to us. Something in our prayer spoke to us, and it was like, oh, that's what we're supposed to do in this situation. And that happened because we were spending time with the Good Shepherd, and He was able to lead us. And so some of you may want to get that good habit of daily devotion time together. And then the last one is show visible signs of trusting. How many of you have ever heard the saying, if you pray for rain, bring an umbrella? Right? If you pray and you believe that God's really going to bring the rain, then show signs that you trust Him by bringing out that umbrella. Right? So one of the ways we can visibly show we're trusting God with our finances is when we give offerings, even though financially it doesn't make sense, right? We add up all the numbers and the money, and we go, it really doesn't make sense to give right now. But I promise you, I've seen it, and I can tell you story after story, when people trusted God anyway in that moment, and they gave that visible sign of trusting in Him, even though it didn't make sense, God blessed them. And God took care of their finances. And so there's other ways you can do visible signs of trusting God. That's just one of the ways. But some kind of visible sign of bringing out that umbrella, like, yes, God, I'm believing You're going to do this. And I'm stepping out in faith.